the 20th century dawned bleakly for the remaining Chinese in Otago. The £10 poll tax that had been set by the government in 1881 had since been boosted to £100 in 1896. Adding to dwindling gold returns, fewer Chinese began to come to Otago. It just wasn't worth it. There were still hardly any females, and those Chinese that were left were desperately lonely. Many saw themselves now as failures and fell into a state of depression, not wanting or being able to return to China.
Having minimal savings, they didn't want to go back because in general they thought that they could make do here. They could, with a bit of wild food like rabbits and so on. Their plight became worse as they grew older.
Even in the boom times of the 1870s, when the prospect of just a few years of hard work would see a young Chinese miner go home with honour and prosperity, his future back there, the long distance, the long time apart, they missed their families, they missed their wives, and love sickness was a recognised affliction among the young miners. As time went on though, times got tougher, the men got older, and some of them realised they would never get home to China. It was a pretty depressing thought, and in 1903-04 up here in Cardrona, a number of isolated old Chinese men took their own lives in a sequence, which shows you, I think, just how tough it was for them at the end of those long, hard lives in difficult, isolated places like this.
Because the Chinese survived mainly by their groupings of family, of clan, and they extended that to people from the same county with the same dialect and the same history. And so they got comradeship and aid through these three tiers of groupings. But as the Chinese gold mining era wore on, more Chinese had died or gone back to China, and you increasingly got left one could call them the Flopson and Jetson of the Chinese population, and they had less support. They got support as long as there's a mate somewhere around, or they knew of somebody in Dunedin, but they were on their own to a large extent.
The reduced number of Chinese did have one positive consequence. There was now a less aggressive attitude displayed towards them by Europeans, and in some areas there was even sympathy displayed towards these toilers from a bygone era. There aren't many accounts of individual relationships between Chinese and European, but there is one from up here in the Serpentine. A guy called Charles Ayton, who was a rabbiter, gold fossicker, dug peat, those sorts of things. He lived up here from 1881, and we know that he got on pretty well with his Chinese neighbours. In 1895, for instance, he came across Ah Siu, who had tumbled into a snowdrift while carrying a heavy load and was in a pretty bad way. So Ayton picked him up, took him back to his own hut, and nursed him back to health. Unfortunately, the weakened condition of Ah Siu meant that he died a couple of weeks later. Nonetheless, he did rescue him, and they were good mates. Ah Pin was another one of Ayton's neighbours. They used to lend each other things. And there was also a Chinese gentleman up here who had the nickname Maori, which is kind of interesting, another friend of Ayton's. But what we get from Ayton's diary is the picture of these pretty tough guys doing it hard out in this very isolated, quite treacherous environment, where really you had to depend on your neighbours, you had to trust each other, and in this case at least, that knew no racial boundaries. Here we are in Welshman's Gully in the old Waikaia Cemetery. Now this ground, all through this gully, was very rich gold-bearing ground. Over the course of almost a century, it was worked over 5 different times, and every time people got quite a bit of gold out of it. And many of those people in the early period, of course, were Chinese. The hill here was ringed with Chinese huts. a bit of a settlement. It wasn't exactly a Chinese camp like you found in some places, but it was certainly a heavy Chinese presence here. And one of the things about the Waikaia era, I suppose it's interesting in the Chinese-European context, is that they all got on pretty well together. The cemetery tells us that story because unlike some cemeteries we've looked at in the course of this filming, there was no separate Chinese section. They weren't outside the fence. They were in amongst everybody else. Now, there aren't many headstones left here. There's one here in front of me for Ah Kim, accidentally killed in 1882 as a 36-year-old. But though we know there's about 40 plus people buried here, and all in together. No separate Chinese section. When he left his home village in the Upper Purniu area, a young Chinese gold seeker named Li Ki-hing was given this beautiful white jade bangle by his father. He was heading for New Zealand, the New Gold Hill, and this would hopefully protect him in the long years ahead. Now, Li Ki-hing never made it back to China. In his old age, he was known as Charlie King, and he was a very well-known identity here in the Waikaia area. He was the last full-blooded Chinese of the gold seeker era to live here. In his old age, he did odd jobs around the village. He worked for farmers. He did a bit of gold seeking still, pottering about the place, but eventually his health broke down and he was taken down to Invercargill to the old men's home there. He didn't like it. He made his way back to the village, but ultimately he had to go back. And on the last journey, he took this, his only real precious possession, and he asked the policeman accompanying him down to Invercargill to stop off in Gore, where there was a friendly Chinese laundryman known to be kind to the old men about the place, and he presented it to him to take care of. Now, that laundryman's son is the well-known Chinese historian Dr. Jim Ning, and in 2012 he presented Charlie King's jade bangle to the Waikaia Museum as a sign and as a symbol of that long association between Guangdong and this gold mining area. Here we are halfway up Welshman's Gully, and once upon a time Chinese huts dotted the area behind me, and where I'm standing is Charlie King's hut, the last full-blooded Chinese gold seeker in this area. And you wonder sometimes these old men who were left here, you know, we sometimes see them as failures. They didn't manage to get back to China, but I just wonder with old Charlie if he didn't just fall in love with this place, because it's a beautiful part of the country, a beautiful part of the world. He was a popular man in the district, renowned for how well he got on with the small children. Families would invite them to their homes for meals, and he was remembered as a very musical man who played the Chinese fiddle. So maybe Charlie just loved this place and wanted to live out the rest of his time here. When news arrived that Charlie had died in 1938, he was greatly mourned by the Waikaia community.
Now, Charlie King was a special case, epitomising the last Chinese in the gold fields, because they obviously weren't competitors anymore, and they obviously couldn't go back to China, and they were settling down here, so they started mixing, and the Europeans got to know them because there's so few of them, and they came into the towns, and so the inland goldfields people actually began to think well of the Chinese again. There was a closing of a circle, as it were. They thought of them well to begin with, and then they ended it that way.
Standing here outside the Chan Ancestral Hall in Shekmar village, I'm really sort of thinking about the huge contrast between Guangdong and Otago. It's warm, it's pouring with rain, but it's a subtropical sort of monsoon sort of weather, completely different to the conditions in Otago. But more than that, there are people everywhere, there are buildings everywhere. It's intense and crowded and lively. So you think of the culture shock of all those men that went out from here to earn money for their families and improve the place, and the temple and the tower are all evidence of that. But imagine them coming back and being immersed again in this very close, rich human environment, and thinking back to Otago And you know, some of them were going back and forth and back and forth. And I think of a guy like Charlie King of Waikaya. This was his home village. But in the end, he never came back here to stay. And I sort of have to think, you know, Waikaya, Shekma, and maybe it was just that he fell in love with the space and the emptiness and the kind of beauty of the landscape of northern Southland there, and he didn't want to come home.
The Chinese around Otago had always been adaptable, but as gold returns began to diminish, they were forced to look for other forms of financial support.
By 1873, there were some 500 miners working the Pomahaka River area around Tapanui. In the 1870s and 80s, as the main trunk railway was pushed south, they supplemented their mining work with labouring work on the railways. And that sort of balance persisted for some years as the gold mining deteriorated, other forms of labouring on farms and public works carried on. The very last miner in this area was working as a gardener, in fact, when he was murdered in 1905. Ham Shing Tong was his name.
While little is known about Ham Shing Tong's murder, the lack of information tells us that the death of an elderly Chinese, no matter how dubious, was not always deemed newsworthy. Many Chinese died a lonely death in this period.
So the Arrowtown Chinese camp is particularly associated with the Siyuk men, but the identity of many of them is lost with their Chinese name. For instance, behind me here is Old Tom's hut, but who was Old Tom? Without his Chinese name, we don't know who he was or where he came from. And his fate is pretty sad as well. Old Tom had a heart attack, fell into his fireplace, and his body wasn't found for a couple of days.
Chinese that ventured into other forms of work often integrated more easily into work than the miners had, but it was still hard going. Roxburgh had a popular boarding house operated by a clever Chinese named Yu He, who really, for this period, married a European.
Yu He had a Scottish wife and they had 5 children together, and when he died in 1886, a year later his wife took the 5 children back to his home county, to Toisan. Now when they got there, these mixed-race children were bullied as foreign devils and had a bit of a hard time, but unfortunately the Scottish wife died a year later and the children were scattered. The youngest of them, however, Yu Jackson was his name, Yu Jackson, he made his way back to New Zealand, completed his secondary education, and he went on to join the staff of the Chinese consulate and ultimately became the Chinese consul and one of the most important Chinese men in New Zealand of his generation. And this is where he began things, here in Roxburgh.
Yu Jackson may seem like a rare shining light from this period of the Chinese in Otago, but many of the younger gold seekers that remained in New Zealand also had success in different ventures they tried their hand at. Back in China, the communities continued to benefit from the remittances that were sent home.
So it's customary in Chinese villages like this to commemorate the outstanding exploits of ancestors, great patriots, such as this temple is commemorating a great patriot from the area, or those who did very well. They would, you know, build schools and help medical facilities be established, or just get their families to be better off by building bigger, stronger, more secure houses. But then there were the ordinary people. And we know of many of those people in the late 19th century who came from Pongwu to Otago. One in particular, Yuan Q Hong, who left here in 1888. He was helped out to Otago by Kum Poi Su Hoi, whose brother-in-law came from this village, in fact. And a number of men from this village actually worked on the Nokomai operation for Kum Poi, including Yuan Q Hong. Now he came back to his village in 1895 and that was supposed to be it. He'd done his sojourn in New Zealand, but things didn't go so well from here, so a few years later he was back to New Zealand. And of course by that time much of the gold was running out. And many of the Pongwu men who were at that tail end of the gold seeker era then moved into market gardening. And they were noted at Kaikorai and Dunedin, but also around the Lower Hutt area. Many market gardeners came from this village. So after the early phase of gold seeking, we have that move on to market gardening and those sorts of operations, but still the links maintained with these villages for a long period, such that it is really a key location in New Zealand's Chinese history. Pongwu and all the little cluster of villages here in the upper Purniu area.
They talked about it when they used to congregate at my father's place, and my father used that as well to raise money to send back to the village to refertilise the land and to help them to recreate the rice paddies so they can be more self-sufficient.
After years of hardships, endurance and depression, it's a little surprise that some Chinese simply gave up. Perhaps one of the surprising things that seems to have been maintained is the Chinese sense of humour. Stories remain today of great jocularity shared by the Chinese despite their difficult circumstances.
So after the gold mining sort of petered out here at Moa Creek, again we have the situation where an elderly miner switches his tack to market gardening. We've got the remnant fruit trees here, we've got his cottage behind us, and he used to go into town, sell his goods off places like Black's, and as he'd come home, he was getting old, so was his horse, might have been a donkey. Anyway, he's clip-clopping up the road, the horse is getting pretty tired, and he had this trick where he'd attach a stick and he'd hang a carrot off the end of it in front of the donkey's nose, and he'd reach out, and it was a pretty effective trick to get him on home, and the both of them safe and sound back in this snug little cottage here at Moa Creek.